Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. This is a real delight for me. I would really appreciate being invited to share with you all. And I know it's being recorded, and look forward to maybe to also hearing from people that watch the recording at some point. Um, I'm going to be chewing mouth lozenges during this a little bit. Hope you don't feel that I'm being rude. It's that I was at a common ground fair up here in Maine, where I am, um, last week, and I had a song that I wanted to share with everybody, and I shouted it out with the people's microphone, and I damaged the equipment a little bit. So I'm still going to be talking and singing a little bit today, but I may also play a couple recordings instead of singing some of the songs to share, just to watch my voice. But I'm Gray Cox, and I'll start sharing some slides here. Um, Let me plug these in and make sure that it's all working okay. Um, let's see here. No. Um, hmm.
Is it not letting you share?
I was going to share in a specific way, but it doesn't have that option. So I'll just share.
Mm.
You can all see the slide there, but you also see all the comments and notes and stuff, right?
Yes.
Yes.
If I do this, does that do it?
Beautiful. That's it.
Okay, great. Okay. And we've got the recording on. Just to note for people, if there's anything that gets said or the like that you would not be comfortable having be shared later, then please don't hesitate to tell Deb or me, and we'll be sure to edit that out. Okay. Um, so I'm going to start with a little bit about me, and then the challenges that I want to talk about today, and then uh, go into it more. Just to start, I moved to Mount Desert Island. It's commonly known, but historically it's the island of Pasumcook, which was a gathering place for Wabanaki people who were stewards and custodians of this landscape where I live, up in what we now think of as northern eastern Maine on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. And that's a picture of it at the top there. And I'm a Quaker. I sort of found myself as a Quaker in my 30s, and that's informed a lot of my work. And I've been involved with the Quaker Institute for the Future, which is a kind of Quaker think tank that tries not only to do research from a Quaker peace-oriented point of view and values, but also using methods that Quakers have developed for seeking common ground and doing communal discernment, seeking unity together as part of the research process itself. So we try to have spirit-led research at the Institute in the research seminars we do and the ongoing circles of discernment that do book projects and so on. And one of those projects was this book called Smarter Planet or Wiser Earth that I was the main author for. And it deals with artificial intelligence, but it does so in the larger context of economics and politics, other kinds of technology and ethics and sort of faith-based context for us in the society we're in now. And so that's going to be a kind of key focus that I'm going to talk about today. But it's really going to be inclusive of these other themes, questions about economics, politics, and so on. And the approach that I take to these comes not only from a Quaker background, but also from a peace studies background. Um, and early on in my career, I got really interested in peace and wrote this book on it, which I'll be drawing on in some of the discussion here, called The Ways of Peace, A Philosophy of Peace as Action. So let me get here now to the next slide. Here we go. Whoops. So here's some challenges that we face. There's a quote by Mohandas K. Gandhi, M.K. Gandhi, that I've really found given me lots of thought over the years. It's from a little book called Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule. And what he says in it is civilization is not an incurable disease,
Mm.
but we must always remember that the English people are currently afflicted by it. Um, and at first, when I read that, I thought, well, that's kind of a cute phrase. But then as I thought about it more and more, it began to seem to me a really profound comment that needs a lot of serious meditation. If we look at our world and the civilization and that we live in and the kinds of problems it's produced, there are a lot of these, what I would call really big freaking problems, you know, like ecological collapse, not just climate change, but, loss of species, loss of habitat, plastics, toxics, polluting, uh, structural violence and injustice and economic inequality pervading the world. The threat of mutually assured destruction with especially nuclear weapons, but also chemical and others. The threat of domination by some kind of superhuman machine intelligence, or maybe superhuman foolishness. Some people sometimes talk about the friendly AI problem. And then there's also sort of kind of moral relativism and the loss of meaning for human life, where people are wondering, how can we find common ground and agree on truth in any meaningful way? And there are a bunch of others that we could list if we wanted to spend more time. But given those problems, I'd like you to consider the following imaginary scenario. Imagine an alien anthropologist from Alpha Centauri, and she's arriving on Earth and she's observing all this, the way we're destroying our habitat, and the sixth great extinction and all this. And her first note home to her PhD advisor, right, is something like this, a species which imposes such radical existential threats upon itself. What are they thinking? And you could imagine that her alien graduate advisor back there in Alpha Centauri might reply something like this. Clearly, their dominant reasoning strategies are, in a profound sense, irrational. The central research question should be, how are they thinking? So I want to invite us all to be thinking about thinking today and the ways we do our thinking in ethics and in economics and politics and elsewhere, and how that affects the actions and decisions that we make. So in our thinking, what I want to suggest is that we need to move towards a wiser earth through a culture of peace. That's kind of the core theme that I want to get at. And now, just by way of preface, I should note that along with these big freaking problems, when I talk to my college students, I teach at College Atlantic, which is a small school for human ecology. I also talk with them about the way in which there's also this other thing that we could call the big freaking problem, which is when you think about ecological collapse or mutually assured destruction and stuff, it's like, there's this freaking out that is very tempting. It seems so overwhelming. And there's a tendency for us, just, I mean, biologically, as individuals and culturally, as members of a society, to either freeze or go into a flight mode or into a fight mode or something else. But we typically find it hard to actually deal with the problem when it's this big, this kind of big freaking problem. And so when that happens, it's really important, to look for ways to cope with that big freaking problem by discharging the emotion and expressing it through artworks or through action, and to build other emotions like a sense of solidarity and connection with others, and doing that in a way that reframes ourselves in bigger pictures. So it's not just me and what I'm doing today and what I'm worried about, but other people and a long run and things that we may not accomplish today, but if we take our time and work at it, you know, inch by inch, row by row, we can make our gardens grow, you know, drop by drop, we can make the wheels of history's great mills that are grinding out our future. We can make them change and move in the way we want. And the other kind of key thing that I think is important with dealing with the big freaking problem is that it's important to have celebrations of successes along the way. Um, Bill Moyer, I don't know if any of you know his work on Doing Democracy. It's a great little book. And one of the things he really emphasizes is how important it is to sort of realize that sometimes what looks like a failure is actually the next step towards the big success. And often people in social movements, if they don't get the big thing they're after in the long run, they tend to diminish or ignore the value of the little accomplishments along the way. And those, it's really important to celebrate those and learn from them and share them to build morale and to find a path. And part of that is having parties and songs. And so I'm going to include a few songs today to help express emotion and celebrate and so on. So let me see here. So I'm going to start with a song, and this one I'm going to sing. Um, couple of the later ones I'll probably play a recording just because I want to guard my voice. I'm supposed to sing again tomorrow somewhere. But this is a song that I often find helps me uh, frame things when I'm dealing with, especially with big freaking problems. You know, so I hope you'll uh, indulge me to share it with you. I
Let's
hope
go.
help you some as well. Okay, and what it's about is slowing down where the eye, sometimes we're really in a rush to accomplish stuff and so on, but sometimes what we really want to accomplish involves connecting with people and finding a path and reorienting ourselves. And so sometimes actually slowing down gets us to where we want to go faster. Okay. Oh, I'm gonna I'm gonna slow right down. Yes. So I can get there sooner. Oh, yes. I'm gonna slow right down so I can get there today. I'm gonna slow right down. Oh, and maybe even come to a full stop. Oh, maybe if I come to a full stop, I'm gonna get there right away. Yes. Well, I hope we can all.
That was full of soul, I must say.
Good. Thanks.
Very
Thanks.
soulful. I was playing the drums to it.
Oh, good. Great. Thanks. Well, feels like we're getting there. um, Together. And you feels like you guys are a really together group that does a lot of that gathering. Well, so part one now, okay? Towards wiser living through dialogue, dialogical reasoning, and a culture of peace. How do we get a culture of peace? In our dominant culture, the concept of peace is most typically defined negatively. This is one of the things I found out when I started doing the book I mentioned earlier on ways of peace. It's typical to define peace in terms of what it's not. It's not war, it's not conflict, it's not violence, which doesn't tell you what it is, you know? And as a philosopher, when I first started studying, this was back when Ronald Reagan was building up nuclear weapons, and I was really concerned about peace, very specifically because of that. I was wondering, well, that's pretty strange, Philosophers, social scientists, they're not even defining it in terms of what it is. What's going on there? And then I noticed another thing, which is that um, we can say nations are warring in the Middle East, but we can't say that they're peacing in Scandinavia. We don't have a verb for peace. And so I started to wonder, well, why is peace obscured as a kind of static absence? And I came up with a hypothesis about it, which is that we live in a culture of conflict where there are these practices that assume that conflict is essential to life. The kind of things I mean, for example, are the way in which in economics, in standard economic theory, people assume that it's all about people chasing after scarce goods, economic competition, right? Or in politics, they assume that politics is really kind of war carried on by other means, and when it breaks down, then you resort to civil war or other kinds of war. In law, what is law about? What is justice? It's sort of defined by, prosecution and defense, and duking it out. It's better than dueling, but, it's a similar structure. And even with reasoning, people, when they talk about the way you reason in a logical or critical way, they'll use these metaphors of war, like, to be a good arguer is to be able to beat your opponent, by defending your own claims and marshaling evidence, kind of the way a general would marshal troops, So these metaphors of war that pervade everything, and even including the way we think about ourselves in terms of sort of emotions fighting within us or fighting against our reason. And to the extent that you think that these practices represent what life is really all about, and that conflict is essential to it, then notice something. I've got a little thing. You can't actually see it, but there's some water in here, okay? And we could say, in terms of things that are essential to water is hydrogen, right? Water is H2O. And that means that wherever there's water, there's got to be hydrogen. So if I wanted to seal this and somehow take all the hydrogen out of it, I'd have to take all the water out of it, right? So similarly, if we think that conflict is essential to life, it's a little bit like saying life is C2O, conflict plus oxygen and maybe some other stuff, right? And if we want to get peace in the sense of just reducing conflict at a bare minimum idea of it, then as we reduce conflict, we've got to reduce the life that it's essential to. And it turns out we talk that way. So, people say, well, Washington, D.C., it's pretty lively right now because there's all this conflict going on, right? And if you want a quieter, more peaceful kind of place, maybe you should move to a small town somewhere, And in fact, if you want, real peaceful tranquility, the best thing would be to go to some really, quiet, sleepy little town, and then go to the cemetery, take a nap, peaceful nap, next to one of those places where people are resting in peace in their grave, right? So we talk in this way that seems to be part of this vision of life in which conflict's essential, and to reduce it, you have to sort of eliminate life. Right? And that seems to obscure the nature of any positive notion of peace at all, right? So when I was thinking about this, I thought, wow, we got to look around for another concept of peace, and also maybe some different concepts of economics and politics and so on, and reasoning, right? Different ways of thinking about these things. And what I came to, well, I'll get to it just a second here, but let me just elaborate this conflict-centered view a little bit more, right? Because a lot of social scientists would say, a core metaphor for society is given by this image of sort of an island where there's two islanders. This would be the simplest society. Two islanders, and there's one coconut, and they both want it. And they're willing to fight for it and kill, right? And everything else, religion, sports, arts, politics, economics, it's just more kinds of coconuts and more kinds of islanders. But there's still, the essential thing is they're fighting over it, right? That's the essence of life. Now, if you wanted to get a different way of thinking about how we deal with people who are different or who have differences with us, there are actually a number of ways of doing it. One, for example, is to use what people talk about in terms of sort of shared problem solving. Right? So you could imagine I might be in dialogue with some Germanic social scientist who would say, conflict is essential to life, right? And I might say, well, I don't know. And he say, yes, it's like two islanders, one coconut, they both want it. And I might say, well, it might seem like that's a conflict, but maybe it's not. I mean, for example, suppose that one of them wants the shell in order to use it to drink things, and the other one wants the meat in order to eat it, right? Then they don't really have a conflict. Actually, they share a problem, which is what's the best way to separate the coconut shell from the meat, right? Now you could imagine the German professor coming back and saying, oh, yes, okay, sometimes there are these little ways of avoiding the basic reality of conflict, but imagine they both want the whole coconut. That's life. They both want the whole coconut. And I might say, well, but even then it depends on why they want it. I mean, suppose it turns out they each wanted to plant, to grow a tree. Then again, they just share a problem, which is what's the best place to plant it and grow it, right? You can imagine the social scientists getting frustrated at this point, saying, well, never mind why they want it. Just they want the whole coconut. Maybe they want to swallow it or use it in some kind of, ritual or something, but they each want it and they want the whole coconut and only one can have it, right? Well, but you could imagine a comeback to even that and say, well, it still seems like they could see that as a shared problem. Yes? And what is this shared problem? And the answer would be, well, there aren't enough coconuts. Right? Now, the point of that little story is not to prove that there's never conflicts, Rather, the point is conflict is an interpretation. It's a way of looking at a situation. And there are other ways of looking at it. You can look at it as a conflict, or you can look at it as a shared problem, right? And so part of what I got interested in was thinking about, well, how could we do economics or politics or these other things in ways that we could look at things as shared problems or maybe in some other way so that we could start to have a culture of peace, right? Where we might think of peace as something you can do, right? And so note that, we've got this is a little chart, what I just went over, but, when people are differing on some issue, they might fight over the resource, or they might share different parts of the resource, like the shell versus the meat, or they might share common goals, like planting a tree, or share problems like the need to create more coconuts. And this is kind of a spectrum of different ways of interpreting their situation, right? And if we want a core metaphor for this, one core metaphor, and there are others, is birth. When you think about it, the process of birth it's dangerous. It can be dangerous. It can be also very glorious and wonderful, right? And usually is. But there are risks. And sometimes, one or both of the people involved die, or get damaged in serious ways. So it's just as serious as any other kind of difference you might have that people interpret as conflict. But it's generally unnatural and inappropriate, and people would not normally view birth as a conflict. A pregnant woman there talking to her midwife wouldn't say, I'm going to beat this little sucker. I'm going to win. Not this freaking parasite, right? That just would not be an appropriate way to frame it. Instead, the idea is that they both they're dealing with the most fundamental differences of their physical integrity, right? And the process of separating each other physically, but also the process of creating this new relationship where they start off and there's a pregnant woman and a fetus. And at the end of the process, if it goes well, they become a mother and a child and part of a family, right? And that can be a very profound metaphor for the way we deal with our differences. Instead of seeing ourselves as in conflict with others, we can see ourselves as trying to give birth to a new relationship, give birth to a new self, new other, new community, right? If you want more exploration of this kind of metaphor, Valerie Kaur has some wonderful talks and a really good book on this. And she talks about how when you're trying to give birth, it's really important to breathe and push and breathe and push. And that's a kind of struggle, but it's not a kind of conflict. Well, here's some other models or metaphors for dealing with differences between people that we might think of. On the left-hand side is sort of what I think of as sort of one of the worst models to use, or metaphors. It's the lose-lose model. Actually, you'd think, who in their right mind would ever adopt a lose-lose model for dealing with differences? And you'd be right to think that, nobody in their right mind would do that. But lots of people have done it. It's the logic of revenge. And there's all kinds of plays like Hamlet and things from the ancient Greeks, tragedies that describe this. And we see it in our world around us, where people don't care. They're going to lose, but they're going to make the other person lose too. And that's the way they're framing it. So it's a step up, or a step progressively, I would say, if you just make the shift from lose-lose to sort of win-lose. That's progress. So when you say to yourself, well, I may want the other person to suffer, but in the end, I want to be better off, whatever happens to the other person, right? That's progress. That's sort of the start of a healing process. You're going to save at least one person, even if it's just yourself. But then a further step is when you start to think, well, maybe we can make this a win-win process, right? Where I win and the other person wins too, right? And all those frames are ones that are still within the realm of sort of talking about conflict, because there's winners and losers. But we can go beyond that and sort of let the conflict language disappear. And in fact, people who write about win-win solutions often do this. They'll talk about problem solving, the way we already did here, or birthing new selves, or another kind of metaphor for this is, basketball. I mean, or other sports where you're playing on a team and you may be competing with the other folks' team, but you're not competing with your own team. You're collaborating, right? That's a really important thing. And the idea of let's get on the same team can be a really important metaphor for thinking about this. Dance as a way of thinking about life is really important as well. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which dance can be extremely collaborative, and there are differences, different roles people can play, and different moves they can make, and different preferences they may have. But it's a dance. It's not a competition, you know. In the Buddhist tradition, with people like Thich Nhat Hanh, there's a whole set of ways of talking about interdependent self-arising or co-arising, which some of you may be familiar with. That's another whole tradition to draw on for this. The Christian tradition of talking about agape love, the kind of love you can have even for your enemies, as something where it's a kind of love that you may not like them, but there's something that you can do in responding to them, to care for them. Another really great metaphor for this is from a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a botanist and a Indigenous American, who's written this wonderful book called Braiding Sweetgrass that talks about sort of how we can combine different traditions and different points of view in ways that braid them together. So, okay, those are some metaphors and approaches. And now what I want to do is focus in on kind of one area or practice of peacemaking, and in particular, in the context of ethical problems, the way we think about them in our society, okay? And I want to talk about what I'll call dialogical reasoning as a sort of a general category for naming things that are involved in negotiation, problem solving, mediation, and conflict resolution, and so on, okay? And so what should be the starting point for thinking about ethics and reasoning about it? Well, when I was growing up, my grandmother and my Sunday school teacher, my mother, they all sort of, told me that it was the golden rule. That's the starting point for ethics, the golden rule, right? And in recent years, I've come to the view that actually it's a pretty flawed rule. I mean, there has some applications that are important, but they're limited. So the golden rule is this rule that says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? Treat them the way you would like to be treated. So the way I like to be treated is going to determine how I treat others. And, in some situations where I'm in a sort of a homogeneous community of, everybody's kind of the similar, like suppose I'm, a 5-year-old and I'm on the playground and Deb has a toy and I think, oh, that's a nice toy. And I grab it, and Deb gets upset when I grab it. And the teacher comes over and says, now, Gray, what if Deb did that to you, right? Well, that can give me pause and make me think, yeah, I wouldn't want her to take the toy from me, so maybe I should take it from her, right? And that's a reasonable, appropriate application. But notice it's because we both like to play with toys and we care about holding on to them at certain times and not having our play interrupted and so on. We're similar in these ways as 5-year-olds, right? But more generally in life, we're dealing typically with people who don't have the same preferences and values as we do in many respects, you know? And so what the golden rule is really inviting me to do is take my values and my preferences and impose them on everybody else, right? It's kind of egoistic or egocentric and ethnocentric even, if I'm applying it to other cultures. Just to take a couple of examples, when I was growing up, my grandmother, she was kind of a German matriarch in a large extended family. Everybody would come over on Sundays to her house and have Sunday dinners and so on. And she knew exactly what she liked and valued. In any situation, she knew what was the right thing to want to eat, and the way to eat it, and the way to do things. And so for her, ethical decision making was really simple. It was almost like being a computer, a kind of mechanical algorithm, right? Where she could say, these children need breakfast, right? Or these people, they're going on a trip or something. This is what I would like to have breakfast. So this is what I'm going to make for them for breakfast. And they will eat it, enjoy it, right? And if it turned out that, what she liked to have for breakfast, for whatever reason, made one of us car sick or get stomach cramps or fall asleep at the wheel trying to drive, that didn't matter, right? The fact that we might have different preferences or values. Similarly, if my mother wanted to breastfeed, her babies, my grandmother had very definite ideas about how she would like to treat, babies and treat, and she would want it. She thought it was horrible and an embarrassment to breastfeed. And so she would want someone to interrupt her and prevent her from breastfeeding. So she did that to my mother and my aunts, right? And this kind of reasoning has been applied also by Quakers, for example, in the 1800s. There are a lot of really well-intentioned Quakers who had the thought that, well, if I was an indigenous American, a pagan, unchristian, living in the United States, I would want to be saved. I would want to be civilized. I would want somebody to come and cut my hair when I'm 5 or 6 years old and take me off to a boarding school and tell me I can't speak my native language anymore and separate me from my parents and my cousins and my family and all the people that would teach me my language and help me sustain my culture. And I would want them to make me into a good civilized Christian. And so they were part of the Indian boarding school movement that did just exactly that to a lot of people in a really harmful way, right? It was really a form of kind of colonialism. And that, in a way, is what the Golden Rule invites us to do, is to colonize others with our own values, okay? So what would be a better alternative? Well, what I would suggest as a starting point, I emphasize starting point, for thinking about ethics is what we could call the rainbow rule, which says do unto others as they would have you do unto them, right? And with this, you're going to look at things pluralistically and assume, well, maybe they have different preferences or needs or concerns or points of view in the world. It's a more diverse, pluralistic way of looking at things. And one thing to note, though, right away is that once you shift to this starting point, then you have to approach ethics with a different kind of thinking. You can't just mechanically use the algorithm to grind out your decision. Because the first thing you have to ask is, well, what do they want, right? What would they prefer? What do they value? Got to enter into dialogue with them. And typically, there's going to be more than one person. And so you got to sort of enter into a dialogue and a kind of joint shared problem solving mode to see how, different people's different interests could all get met in appropriate ways. And so dialogue is going to become an essential part of the process of thinking once we adopt the rainbow rule. And in fact, we almost shouldn't call it the rainbow rule because it's not a rule in the mechanical sense, like a logical algorithm. As I say, it's an orientation where you start to negotiate with others and collaborate in cultural and ecological exchange if you're looking at the larger world. Okay, so I would suggest this is a place we should start if we want to culture peace. And then here's a little graphic that I came up with a wonderful cartoonist, Stephen Myers did it, and a friend, Craig Freshley, who's a conflict resolution person, worked with me to help we designed this together. And the idea is that with the golden rule, somebody sees two kids and is assuming that they both want to see the baseball game the way she would want to. And so she provides this box to help the little kid that's sitting there get up on it to see the game. It's just assuming that's what he wants. In the rainbow rule, she instead sort of asks, well, what do you want? You're looking there kind of glum. What's your problem? And it's clear, well, he wants a hot dog and something to drink, right? So this is sort of a graphic example of the way this kind of approach of a rainbow rule can pervade not just international policy and so on, but our everyday lives and really the nuances of it. But so once started, how do we reason about ethics using dialogical thinking? Well, here, I think it'll be helpful to contrast dialogical with monological inference, and just to make clear what we're talking about, all right? So the tradition of monological or one-sided reasoning that employs mechanical algorithms, it goes back to Aristotle in terms of developing formal systems of it. And when I talk about algorithms, I mean things like are listed here. If all A are B and C is A, then C is B. It's sort of a rule for combining sentences to generate conclusions, right? And an example would be one that Aristotle used, kind of classic, where the input or the premises that he started with are all men A are mortal, and Socrates C is a man. And so the output, once you run the algorithm, is Socrates is mortal, right? And in a way, it's when you first look at that, it's like, no duh. This is like it's not really surprising or it doesn't seem very informative, right? But it also does seem very, very logical, almost mechanically logical, right? And that's the idea for this kind of logic. The thing is that when you employ this kind of algorithm in strings of argument, you can start to get more interesting results. So Euclid came along using Aristotle's kind of logic and developed whole proofs of geometry, like the Pythagorean theorem and all this kind of stuff that provides the basis for doing land surveying and trigonometry and building boats and everything else, right? And with Isaac Newton, sometime later, you get these proofs for a basic physics, that is the basis of rocket science, the basis of being able to shoot rockets to the moon, right? With surprising results that nobody would initially think until they sort of worked out all these longer logic. And this inferential model of reasoning, the sort of where you start with, and I should go back and just review this key point, with these three steps. The first step is you have your premises or assumptions. And then the second step is you apply the algorithm. And then the third is you get the output, right? That process is the same process that Alan Turing and other people who have created the modern computer, at least the classic modern computer, used to develop a model of it and to work it. And this model of reasoning is monological, the mono one kind of idea of logic, in the following sense. One person who understands the premises and has the algorithmic rules can draw the conclusions. Or for that matter, one machine can do that, okay? Okay, now, in terms of applying this to ethics, an awful lot of moral philosophy and public policy nowadays, arguments in state legislatures and in Congress and elsewhere, relies on 18th century ideas of morality and thinks of ethical rationality as a kind of monological process of linear inference, the kind we just looked at, that's aimed at justifying choices between given options, right? Okay, so let me just clarify what I mean by that. So the idea is you're just given the options, you're trying to choose between them, and the way you do that uses these assumptions from the 18th century that I'll mention just a minute here. Now, one way that this is often applied by teachers of philosophy and ethics in contemporary world and universities and so on, and in professional organizations, is by using ethical dilemmas like this trolley problem. Probably a number of you have run into this before. The trolley problem, if you've ever seen, what is it, The Good Place? There's a TV show where there's this kind of slightly geeky, interesting philosopher who's constantly worrying about these kinds of problems. Well, with the trolley problem, the idea is you imagine a situation in which a trolley is coming down the track. It's set so that it's going to swerve to its right and run over 5 people. They're going to die. And they can't hear it coming. They're distracted. They don't see it coming. And they're all going to die. And we're certain of this in this imaginary case, right? They're all going to die unless the person who's there at the switch with a big question mark, right? She can actually flip the switch and that will move the trolley car off to its left. And so it'll miss those 5 people. Unfortunately, there's somebody there who is going to get run over. And that person also is out of hearing. They don't see the trolley coming. You know, you can't do anything to avoid this. So that your dilemma is, do you let the 5 people die from the trolley coming down, or do you flip the switch and save the 1 person, right? And in university ethics courses, people look at this kind of thing, and they come up with different kinds of arguments. So one is, they might start with it's called utilitarian reasoning, like Jeremy Bentham started off with. And this is probably one of the most common ways of reasoning currently in our society, where the key premise is, if an option or a choice yields the greatest net happiness to all concerned, then you choose it. So it's all about greatest net happiness. And the second premise you would add, if you're a utilitarian, would be to say, well, the option of pulling the trolley switch to kill 1 instead of 5 will yield the greatest net happiness. And so the conclusion you'd have is, pull the trolley switch. Let the other guy get run over, right? But there's some people who would argue for a different kind of starting premise. Immanuel Kant, for example, and also people who argue for human rights tend to have this kind of view, where they would say, if you cannot will a policy from every point of view, you shouldn't act on it. So if you can't, will it from the point of view, for example, of the guy who's going to get run over, who wouldn't have otherwise, then you shouldn't do it. Every person counts is sort of part of the idea, right? And you don't let the happiness of the majority overrule the welfare and the rights, especially of the individual, right? So this kind of trolley puzzle, as I mentioned, is often used to teach ethics in places like Harvard. This is from a course that's online. You can actually go online and see it on YouTube by Michael Sandel, where he's teaching it at Harvard to a very, very huge crowd in a very popular course. And it's kind of a mainstream way of approaching these things. If you go and watch the video that's on YouTube, it's really interesting because Sandel looks at a number of different variations and different kinds of trolley problems. And most of the students initially think they should be utilitarian, I mean, save 5, you lose 1. Well, it just makes sense. It just seems mathematically right? But then he introduces this other example, further dilemma, that's really a variation. He says, well, okay, suppose you're a surgeon and you have 4 patients that are in need of a life-saving transplant. Maybe one of them needs a heart, another needs some lungs, another needs kidneys, so on, right? And they're in your clinic, and in your waiting room, you've got a healthy young person, some guy in his late 20s who has fallen asleep, right? And so as a utilitarian, you think, oh, here's my chance. I could go in and anesthetize this guy, put him to sleep permanently, right? And sacrifice his organs. He'd never even know the difference. He'd just never wake up, right? No pain caused to him at all. And I would save these 4 people, right? 1 for the many. As a rational utilitarian, aren't I even obligated to do that, right? So Sandel puts this out to the class, and there is this groan, this kind of, there are all these students who are thinking, well, I thought I was going to be utilitarian, but no, right? So, but then it turns out what Sandel asks if any of them would sacrifice the one person, and he sees a hand up in the back of the building, right? And so he thinks, this is great. I got a student who's a hardcore utilitarian. We'll have a really good argument here, right? So he calls on the student, but the student says, well, hang on just a second. I got to take a sip here. Student says, I wouldn't sacrifice the one healthy person, but what I would do is I try to find some way to choose one of the people that's going to die anyway. Maybe one of them could volunteer, or maybe they could have a lottery, or maybe, some of them could help, pay somebody to make the sacrifice. I don't know, but we'd figure out some way so that we could sacrifice one of the people who's going to die anyway to save the other three, right? Well, when the students hear this, it's like they burst into applause. It's like this, wow, at last, we got out of this frickin', dilemma, they're really excited by this. But Sandel, as a professional philosopher teaching in the university, sort of pauses. He waits till the applause dies down. And then he says, well, that's a good idea. In fact, it's a very good idea, except for the fact that it completely ignores the whole point of the philosophical example. And then he drops the discussion and goes on to another example, right? And in doing that, what Sandel is doing is common practice, where the idea is to force people to confront the dilemma, right? Force them to decide, am I going to be a Kantian or a utilitarian? Force them to clarify their values and practice the traditional symbolic logic kind of reasoning that generates its conclusions, and just accept the consequences, right? He thinks that's what, tough-minded learning to do ethics and also learning to be a rational person is about. But for my money, if I have a student going out into the world and they can think of solutions like this, that's great. That's what I want them to be doing out there. I don't want them to get bogged down in dilemmas. I want them to come up with solutions, right? And so this is an example of one element of some others of dialogical reasoning, this looking creatively for alternatives, right? Okay, so let's look at dialogical reasoning more generally and the other things that it involves. With dialogical reasoning, unlike the monological reasoning, like the Aristotelian logic, it involves negotiation, shared problem solving, conflict transformation, and it has 3 steps, but they're different. The first step is you encounter somebody else who differs from you. So there's 2 points of view, right? And they differ. They don't agree on their premises. They don't agree on their definitions of terms. In fact, they don't even see the world in the same way. If you took them both out into the forest somewhere and showed them a bunch of trees, one of them might say, oh, what wonderful lumber, I can cut a lot of board feet of lumber out of this, make a lot of money. And the other one may say, oh, what wonderful bird habitat. Can't wait to try and conserve it, They're actually seeing different stuff when they look, right? So the central part of the reasoning process involves trying to resolve those conflicts, those differences, right? By pursuing strategies of negotiation, problem solving, and so on, right? Finding common ground in the way you define terms, finding assumptions you can agree at least tentatively on to get you further along in the dialogue. And the aim is to get to the third step, which is genuine voluntary agreement, where you can commit to some conclusion or some action that you'll take together, okay? Now, this kind of dialogical reasoning is guided by goal-oriented strategies, or what we could call teleological algorithms rather than mechanical ones. You can't just grind it out. You're trying to get somewhere, but in order to get there, you got to be creative. Okay. So for these 3 steps, the kinds of strategies you can use include, for example, one we've sort of already encountered, which is multiply your options. This is a classic strategy that in a little handbook on negotiation, Getting to Yes. It's kind of one little classic book if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Multiplying your option whenever you face a dilemma is always good, even if it isn't a dilemma. The more options you have, the better chance there is that one of them will satisfy everybody's interests. A second kind of strategy is to focus on the interests behind people's positions. So oftentimes somebody may say, look, this is my offer. It's my final offer. Take it or leave it, my way or the highway, right? But when you're in that situation with somebody, it's really helpful to ask, well, okay, it sounds like you're really committed to that. What is it that you like so much about that position? Why are you interested in that? What's the underlying motivation, right? And the more you explore that, the more you can begin to find ways in which actually their interests might be similar with somebody else's. It may be they just want the shell of the coconut and you want the meat, for example, right? And there are lots of great examples of this in history. These other strategies where you separate the people from the problem, sometimes the issue is not concerned with sort of the physical distribution of what's going to happen, who gets the meat, who gets the shell of the coconut, but more symbolic, more about relationship, about have you hurt my feelings? Are we going to be friends afterwards? How are we relating to each other? And so working on those kinds of issues is a distinct kind of thing that has to be handled differently. And also there's a suggestion that it's important to look for independent criteria, objective criteria. Instead of just saying it's my way or the highway, you can ask, well, what are some standards that we could investigate, that we could, if I hit your car and it looks like it's kind of damaged, but we disagree about how much damage there is, we could stand there and sort of argue back and forth. I think, it's only about $100 and you think it's about 2,000, but there are ways we could go and actually get independent evaluators of different kinds that would help us settle that in a more objective way. Okay. So a key thing about these strategies is that they're goal-oriented in the sense that you're trying to get to somewhere, get to agreement, right? You're not just moving from whatever you have as your assumptions. You're trying to be creative, right? So it involves that kind of other kind of thinking. So there are examples of specific techniques for doing that. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip over this one. I might come back to it later. But just note, because I think you guys probably run into this kind of thing in other contexts, that there are lots of different strategies for doing dialogical reasoning. I already mentioned Getting to Yes, which is written basically for people who are sort of English-speaking, North American business people, government people, NGOs, and so on. But John Paul Lederach has written this book, Preparing for Peace, that talks about strategies for looking at ways in which people in Latin America and East Africa and so on work on it. Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed offers another kind. There are indigenous communities from around the world that have different kinds of methods for, trying to find unity and common ground and dialogue practices. And these can all vary. The Quakers, the Quaker process of communal discernment is it, and seeking unity is another great example. So my point here is there are lots of traditions, feminist consciousness raising traditions and so on, that we can draw on for doing this kind of stuff. And it's very, very studyable, learnable kind of discipline that we can practice. Now, one of the traditions that's really important, I think, to emphasize is Gandhi's. And people often just associate Gandhi with fasting and being skinny and wearing a loincloth, but actually he was a systematic thinker who had all kinds of ideas about ways of doing things, including how to have dialogue, how to petition people and approach them and do research and so on. And there's this wonderful book by Joan Bondurant called The Conquest of Violence. If you're interested in Gandhi's thought, I highly recommend it. But one of the key innovations that Gandhi added to this was concerned with the situation in which, people are resisting coming to agreement with you. And they may resist it because they're hard-headed or because they're just having trouble getting it into their head what you're saying. But it also may be that they are insulated in some way. They feel like they don't have to listen because they have the power to do what they want, whether you like it or not, right? And often oppressors are in that situation where they're just not paying attention, right? And Gandhi developed this method he called satyagraha, which stood for satya is the part that stands for truth, and graha stands for holding on. And it meant clinging to truth was one way he would translate it, clinging to truth as part of the dialogue practice. But he also referred to it as a love force or truth force, right? Because the idea was that this was a practice that you could do in various ways that could supplement the just talking parts of the dialogue, right? And it involved the kind of thing at stake when people, for example, thought that that as Indians, they should be able to make salt out of the Indian Ocean. Whereas the British thought that they should be able to prevent people from making salt so that they could have a monopoly and tax people and make a lot of money off of it. And Gandhi thought that was, both an insult to them and also a violation of their national sovereignty, And so he encouraged people to go on a big salt march and protest it. If you ever watch the movie Gandhi, it's a wonderful episode around all this. But the key thing is that in doing this satyagraha, clinging to this truth about respect, self-respect, and dignity, and so on around salt making, people could do three things with the suffering. When they get arrested or beaten or thrown in jail, one function of all that could be to help them discern the moral truths for themselves. So if I'm thinking that, yeah, I should be able to make salt, but then I think, I'm going to get arrested and get the crap beat out of me, it sort of gives me pause. How serious is this salt stuff, right? Is this really a moral truth at stake here or not, right? So I can do my own discernment if I'm willing to self-sacrifice. It's easy to sacrifice somebody else's welfare, but sacrifice my own helps me discern moral truths in a different way. Second thing that it can help is to demonstrate moral truths to others. Gandhi would talk about melting their hearts. So, if I'm getting, beat up by the police or the bystanders or others may be watching this and say, wow, this guy is really committed to this. It really seems to really believe it, there, and it really does seem to have a sense of dignity. He's not just some, quasi animal that I can use to get taxes from. This is a person with dignity, with some moral discernment that I should listen to. Maybe it's demonstrating to me the moral truth involved. And the third thing that satyagraha, the clinging to truth in these ways, can do with boycotts, with courting arrest, with a wide variety of other kinds of activities. There's hundreds of these things that Gene Sharp's book on the principles of nonviolence and is also his book, Waging Nonviolence, gives lots of examples of all this stuff. The other thing it can do is help to defend the moral truths by active resistance to the oppression, right? So at some point for the British, for example, when they had not just hundreds, but thousands and thousands and thousands of people, they didn't have any place to put them in jail. They didn't need, soldiers and police to sort of manage it. It just became an ungovernable situation, because people were refusing to obey something they saw as a unjust law. Okay, so satyagraha can serve these functions in a way that helps to advance non-violently moral truths in the course of dialogue, to actually try to persuade the other. Okay, and a key point of this is that for Gandhi, this process is one that it could at least aim at and try to seek emergent objective truths, where it's not just my opinion or my values or my culture, but something that's somehow objective. And I can know this because I discern it through self-sacrifice and demonstrate it to others through self-sacrifice and can defend it through coordinated action. Okay. Okay, so it's 12 o'clock here. I'm running just a little bit behind what I'd hoped, but not too much. I wanted to share a couple more songs. Maybe I'll and so here's one. Hang on a second. And I'm not going to sing this just because my throat may go out on me if I do. But I have a recording that I made of it that I would like to share. Okay. And there are actually two songs here that I want to share with you. And the first one has to do with the way in which we deal with one of the challenges of dialogue, which is to really stop talking and listen, to hear others, right? It's called In the Silence. And the second one has to do with the second challenge that I'll come back to, but let me just play this song, okay? In the Silence. In the silence, midst division, there are voices. They are speaking. They are calling us to caring that connects us each to all. In the darkness and confusion, there's a light that lets us see through the sharing of a vision that makes you and I a we. Midst the tumult and the turmoil comes a power transcending fear. It's a power that transforms us through this presence of love here. In the silence, midst division, there are voices. They are speaking. They are together. That connects each to all. Thanks for letting me share that. Now, I have another song I want to share. And this one is actually a YouTube video. So maybe I'll show it as a YouTube video, okay? And it's about the other part of dialogue, which is expressing your own views, right? And trying to do it in a way that communicates the strength and care of who you are, and but in a way that can still be open to listening to others, right? So let me see here. Okay. It's called We Had a King Once. We had a king once. He imposed tariffs on tea in Boston, but we taught him
We are patriots, we love our liberty, and we shall overcome any royal wannabe. We had a king once, he sent his armies into our cities to impose tyranny. But we are patriots, we love our liberty, and we shall overcome any royal wannabe. We had a king once, thought his word was law, thought he could make us all kneel down and beg and crawl. But we are patriots, we love our liberty, and we shall overcome any royal wannabe. We had a king once, he caused a long train of abuses and pain and suffering. But we are patriots, we love our liberty, and we shall overcome any royal wannabe. We had a king once, but never more shall we accept a tyrant in our democracy. For we are patriots, we love our liberty, and we shall overcome any royal wannabe. We had another king, one who showed us how to use nonviolence, and we need it now, for we are patriots, we love our liberty, and we shall overcome any royal wannabe. Yes, we are patriots, we love our liberty, and we shall overcome any royal wannabe. Yes.
Hey, everyone. So I am asking you to please make a contribution to the Democratic National Committee, the DNC. And I know.
Go into that. There we go. There we go. So, what I guess part of the reason why I wanted to share those both is that I had an experience actually last Saturday when I hurt my voice a little bit at this Common Ground fair. It's a very big fair, and I sang that song in public, and a guy came up to me afterwards. He was really distraught. It was like, what are you doing? People just want to be quiet. They just want to have fun at the fair. What are you doing disrupting all this, right? And his wife, he was like in his 70s, about my age. And his wife was sort of saying, come on, Bill, come on, don't get caught up in this. Like she's seen him get caught up in arguments before. But I sort of welcomed him. I said, well, I'd love to talk with you about it, And we started in, and he was really upset. He's a veteran, and he thought that I was, he was concerned about the political point of view I was expressing. But we sort of hung in, and he was really gracious about it. And we talked for about half an hour, and sort of started sharing points of view and where we really have common ground. So he was clearly somebody who voted for Trump and was very upset with Biden and so on, right? We left. When we parted, I introduced myself. I said, I'm Gray Cox. He said his name was Bill. He didn't give me his last name or any contact information. But then later, yesterday, actually, I got in the mail an envelope from him with a copy of a newspaper that, because I'd asked him, well, what do you use for news sources? He sent me a copy of a paper called Epic Times that he uses for resources, and sort of continuing the conversation a little bit. And I thought, wow, this is hard. It was a half hour of standing there with everybody else walking around, and we were just sort of, negotiating. Can we agree on anything here? But we sort of hung in there, and dialogue started to happen. It seems to me that's part of what we need to be doing at this point, as well as other stuff. But it's hard to enter into this kind of dialogue because it takes both kinds of things that stretch us. Listening, to really different points of view, but also being willing to voice our own, So I wanted to take a break now. I think that would be appropriate for folks at least to have a bathroom stretch at this point. And what I would invite you to do is, if you're with anybody else, to pair off. I guess you guys are all online though now, aren't you?
We are.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll just tell you what I was thinking, and you can sort of imagine it while we're taking the break, okay? And work just on your own, rather than trying to set up breakout rooms and all that. What I was going to invite people to do is to think about someone you would like to be in dialogue with, where it might be hard. And just think about why you care, why you would want to be in dialogue with them, and what's going to make it hard, and what would help. And just do that as part of a kind of exercise of reflection, and give ourselves, I don't know, Deb, should we have about 10 minutes for a break, or that sound good? Or?
Let's go 10.
Okay. We'll come back at 22 minutes after the hour. Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Bam.
Thank you for the indulgence. It's a music church sometimes here.
Great. I love it. It's great. So maybe I'll plunge ahead with part 2, and then I'll try to be sure to end by 12 o'clock your time, so we have a good half hour at least of discussion.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, as I go through, I may skip over some slides or do them in a shorter version. We can always come back to them later if people want to. Okay. And so let me share my screen again here. Here we are. Okay. Okay, can everybody see it okay? You see, Deb, you can see it
Got
okay?
it.
Okay, good. So this is part 2. Before it was sort of, what's the path of peace for dialogue to create a wiser earth? And this part has to do with sort of the structures of our civilization in economics and politics, AI technology, or faith practices. I'm going to try and talk a little bit more about institutional structures and social structures that might come out of all this. And just to give a sort of a brief overview, this is a pretty crowded chart. I'm not going to try and explain it all in detail. The key thing I wanted to do with it is to sort of talk about a way in which that when people talk about having a sort of a smarter planet, often they have in mind one where it's dominated by monological reasoning, the sort we were talking about. And the wiser Earth that I'm talking about here today involves this kind of dialogical reasoning, right? Where you're looking at things from 2 points of view or more. And the key thing to note from this chart is that actually this distinction gets played out in different ways in different areas of life. So in ethics, we already talked about the ways in which Bentham and Kant are used often to try and justify choices, where you have some fixed choice you're given. But there's this alternative kind of Gandhian, Quaker, other peacemaking approach that doesn't accept the choices as givens, but rather is trying to create new choices and opportunities that can take everybody's concerns into account. And that basic contrast applies also in economics and politics and technology. So in economics, there's this notion of a rational economic man that asks people to sort of maximize their profit or their personal utility or the GDP of their country by rational calculation, in this very mathematical linear way. And I want to say a little bit more about how actually when we think about economics, we can think of ourselves more as history makers or change makers, where we're pursuing these open-ended projects in community with other people. And in politics, I want to contrast sort of what it is to think about the world in terms of a national security state that's pursuing power through what's often referred to as realpolitik, power politics, and how that contrasts really with thinking about politics as something that communities do, where they're pursuing self-rule or swaraj through nonviolent methods. And then technology, and this is where we'll get to the AI stuff, as can be viewed as something that's trying to create smart systems or a wiser Earth. So first, to talk about economics just a little bit, there's this distinction that got introduced by John Cobb and others some time ago between material growth and development in economics. And it's pretty clear if you just kind of do the math or just try to draw diagrams that, if you live on a finite planet like Earth, it's a finite system. Ultimately, it requires some kind of, for our economy, average zero growth. I mean, it may go up and down a little bit, but at some point, we're going to reach the limits of how much of the sunlight and the material resources and the surface of the planet and so on we can use, right? Or else it'll all be gone and the economy will collapse. So that's true of growth. But now this distinction between growth and development is useful because, well, first of all, to think about it with a human being, right? We're born as these very small, tiny creatures, and we grow physically. We get more extended until we're like in our early 20s or something, right? And then depending on how we eat and how many candy bars or whatever we have, we stop the basic growth, right? But that doesn't mean we stop developing, When we get to be 20, we may stop growing taller, but we can acquire more moral stature and more creative abilities as artists and so on. There are all these ways in which we can develop by the ways we rearrange our behavior and the molecules in our brain and stuff, right? So the same thing can be true of economies. They could grow in terms of their material consumption to a certain point where they reach the limits of growth, the limits of ecological capacity or carrying capacity. But then there isn't any reason why they couldn't, in at least some extent, in some ways, continue to develop and improve people's lives, even though they're not adding to the material growth, right? So one of the big debates that people have nowadays is, zero growth or not. People are afraid that if we just try to have stop growth and have a no growth economy, that we'll actually go into a tailspin and have negative growth and something like the Great Depression. And so trying to figure out, well, what's the big picture, medium and short-term, medium-term, and long-term vision that we should be working for with our economy if we really take seriously ecological footprint and carbon footprint and stuff like that. And I want to suggest that we have to think about it as a sort of a transition, right, in stages. So in the short term, there are things that we need to shrink in our economy. We need to shrink the amount of petroleum that we're consuming. We have to shrink it down to zero, basically, in terms of what we actually burn and put into the atmosphere in order to deal with climate change. And there are a variety of other kinds of things that we need to shrink in terms of material growth. On the other hand, there are things that we need to grow, in the short term and medium term. We need to grow the amount of food that a number of people in the world are getting. We need to grow the amount of housing that's available in healthcare for people who need it, So people who live in, houses, it's, just a couple whose kids have all gone off to college or gone off to work somewhere else, but they have, 8 bedrooms or something in their little mini mansion or whatever. They need to kind of think seriously about shrinking. But other people who are living on the streets, that's part of what we need to be growing to address. And there are going to be other things like, growing organic farms and solar panels and wind farms and so on, right? So it's sort of a mix of shrinking some things and growing others. And then part of the next question is going to be, well, how do we direct and continue development where, people can be improving the quality of their lives and exploring new regions of art and enhancing their spiritual experiences and finding, that maybe they're not building more meeting houses or churches or whatever, but they're, using their time, whatever spaces they're in, for more spiritual experiences that enrich them you know? So we have to think about that. And then a key question with all this is, in order to make these sort of changes that will get us to the target of kind of more or less zero material growth in the future, but with continued development, in this sense, we've got to scale up. The forces at work now, the corporations and governments that are really trying to drive the economy, they're driving us towards ever greater material growth with all kinds of bad consequences like economic inequality and ecological collapse and so on. So the forces that are trying to work for this other kind of future model have to figure out how to scale up, you know? So I want to talk a little bit about how to do that in my next little chart here. Whoops. Here we go. So part of it involves changing our self-concept, including our way we think about how to think about economics. And I want to suggest it's a transition from thinking about ourselves as what economists would call a rational economic consumer, or they talk about rational economic man, and they use the word man in a way that has associations that are probably appropriate for the concept they have in mind, right? But a rational economic agent or man is someone who, you know, looks at the choices in front of them and tries to calculate how to maximize their happiness, or their what economists call their utility preference, the benefits of their income as individuals and for communities and for nation states. They're trying to maximize their gross domestic product, right? In contrast, there's this idea of thinking of yourself as a history maker or a change agent, where what you're trying to do is not maximize your income or your happiness or whatever, but you're trying to have meaningful change. You care about stuff and you want to make history. You want to make stuff happen. You want to end addiction in Houston, you know, or you whatever it is that you're working on, you know, you care about it and you're willing to make sacrifices for it, right? You know, in fact, you're happy to make those sacrifices because you feel like that's the way you give birth to the kind of future you want, right? And that's what change agencies are about. You're sort of changing the diapers of a messed up society, and you know, in order to nurture the birth of new relationships and community, right? So here's some examples of ways that you could begin to do that. One is what we might call a marchathon, and I first thought about this when I went to the Women's March. This was when Trump first got elected, first time around. And there were, you know, like 1 million people who were going to go to Washington, D.C. and be in this big march. And I thought, well, the way a lot of people do about that, well, yeah, it seems like we're spending a lot of money going there. What good does it do? You know, actually, you know, it's important to see other people, to rally, to build community, and all that kind of stuff. But I thought, well, but what if we, you know, didn't just go and march, but we raised money? Like, people were really concerned about Planned Parenthood and its funding. So I thought, what if we tried to raise money for Planned Parenthood? So this was about a week before the march. I went to some friends and sort of said, well, I'm going to have like a marchathon. So I'm going to go. As I understand, you're not able to go. Would you sponsor me, you know? And I got some people to sponsor me for, you know, walking in the march, just the way you would for any other kind of fundraiser, march kind of a thing. And then I donated the money to Planned Parenthood. And I am not a very good fundraiser. I don't like, personally, I'm uncomfortable asking people for money, you know, I just am. But even so, I was able to raise $340 for Planned Parenthood there, right? And I thought, gee, if I'd planned ahead, you know, and we had other people working on this, how far could this go? And it occurred to me, well, you know, if you had, if each person going on the bus, I mean, you know, it can cost like $100, depends on where you leave from, to take the bus or whatever transport to get to Washington and back for a big march like that. You know, and if each person had like 10 friends who couldn't go, but they were willing to say, well, I'll kick in $100, right? Just as an example, right? Then that would be, for each person that went, 10 times 100, which is $1,000. And then if you actually had 1 million people go on that march, which something like that went on that march. And in fact, there were a lot of other people who didn't go to Washington, but went to other cities for a similar kind of march activity. If they'd all collaborated on that, you know, $1,000 times 1 million people is $1 billion, right? So, you know, one way to sort of start funding and scaling up work for Planned Parenthood or for climate change or what have you would be, you know, to have marchathons, more marchathons. If we're having marches anyway, why not turn them into marchathons? You know, so that's one kind of way, and it's one of the okay. Here's another kind of way, something I would call giving the gift of gifts. Okay, so a lot of people spend money around the holidays, Christmas especially. Hang on just a second here. You know, so some time ago I thought, well, you know, actually it's like 20% or more of retail sales happen just right in the month of December. So what if for holidays like that, and maybe also for birthdays and other events, if instead of, you know, going, I mean, I have hated buying presents often because I go and I go to a mall someplace or I go online and I'm sort of looking for something I could, you know, that some plastic thing from China or whatever, you know, that I can get and to tell, you know, my grandchild, you know, that I really love them. Right? You know, it's like, it's very frustrating. Or tell my wife I really love her and she, you know, I have trouble picking out the right thing for her. So what if instead, you know, you write a check and you sign it, you put the amount in, whatever it would be, $100 or $50 or 20, whatever it is, right, for you, that you would give them in the form of a present. And instead, give them a check and invite them to choose how they're going to spend it, right? And maybe they need the money and they should spend it on themselves, and that's fine. That's great. But on the other hand, there might be some organization that they know of that they think would help make this a better world for them in the future. And so invite them, encourage them to consider writing the check out to those organizations, right? So this does a couple things. One is it takes money that I would normally otherwise spend on myself and material objects for me, and I stop doing that. So it reduces my material consumption. And then it also gives them the opportunity to actually be giving a gift. So it helps them start to think, oh, I'm becoming a change agent. I'm going to make some history here because I'm going to make something happen with Planned Parenthood or climate change or whatever it is that they care about, right? So you're giving them a gift of giving gifts as a way of helping them become gift givers, right? And so this is part of a more general thing about economics for scaling up that involves redirecting our income away from personal material consumption towards political and social change, towards really three things: that kind of change, political, social change, and then socially and environmentally responsible investment, which is a distinct thing that we also need. We need to be investing in organic farms and stuff like that. And acts of solidarity. There's some people who should be consuming more. The average American is not that person. The average American is consuming so much that if everybody on the planet consumed as much as we do, the planet would not be able to survive. We would need at least 2 or 3, maybe more extra planets, right? But there are people who need to consume more. And so giving to them, not as charity, as sort of like, I'm a big shot and I can give you money, but as solidarity and collaboration, right? So at what rate should we be doing that kind of giving? Well, one way to think about that is to think about climate change and ecological footprint and what would be an average income level for material consumption for the average American and for the average person around the world that would be sustainable. And, you know, maybe we should just use all the rest of our income above that level for these other things, for political, social change, investment, and solidarity, right? Now, when I polled people and sort of thought about it and tried to read about it, it seems like, there's a lot of nuance to figure out the details of all that. And I think each person has to follow, discern that for themselves. But typically for average American, probably something around 50% would be kind of a good starting point to think about aiming at, right? And somebody might say, well, you're asking me to, give 50% of my income away? I just can't do that. I couldn't live on 50% less than I am now living on. Well, actually, though, for all of us, right, there's a way in which we all know other people who are living on less than we are, as well as people who are living on more. And so we can look around and see, well, how does somebody do it? Live on 10% less, for example. And for the first year, maybe just aim at 10%, 10% of my income to redirect in these ways. And then the next year, if I've started to do things like downsize my size of my house or the activities I use for recreation or what I eat and drink and so on, by learning from other friends, I will have also made some new friends, and they will be living on less than I am, and I'll be able to figure out even more ways, right? And so the idea would be over 5 years, I could, have this as a very reasonable goal if I went 10% a year for 5 years. The reality is, for most people, if you ask them, it feels like they couldn't live on less. They'd be happy if they just had 20% more. And it doesn't matter what level they're at. They tend to always think that. But the other reality is that people go through this kind of transition all the time. They get divorced, they get sick, they move to a new job, something happens in their life, and they suddenly are living on significantly less. And a lot of times they're happier. They lost that other job, but God, they were miserable in that frickin' job. And now they're happy, So I just would invite you all to be thinking about this. And the thing about this idea is that it's not just about becoming good, it's about helping to provide a way of scaling up. Because as we start to do this as individuals, right, we should also be inviting the organizations that we give to be thinking about these same issues. And they can organize to recruit other people, to try and build solidarity groups and affinity groups that are doing this kind of giving, so that we can start to scale up and get $1 billion on a weekend for some needed cause, right? And use part of that to spread the word and get more people to join the movement, right? So capitalism has profit as a way of scaling up, meeting the future halfway, giving half our income towards the future is a way we can scale up, and get others to wake up, to understand what's going on and see how they can join in. Okay. Well, so those are some thoughts about economics. Here's a few thoughts about political economy. Notice I didn't just say politics, but really political economy, because I think in the end, it's really important to see economics and politics as interconnected. A lot of the debates and criticisms of the kinds of points of view I'm talking about here today take the form of accusing somebody of being a communist, for example, right? And, rather than a capitalist. And I think one sort of starting point for thinking about politics and economics is to realize that there is no purely capitalist government or economy on the planet, except in sort of free fire zones of criminal gangs, right? Everywhere else where there's a government, there's some kind of mixed economy where the government has a role and it provides for laws and ways of identifying who owns stuff and maybe some basic investment in infrastructure like roads and other things. There's always at least some mixed economy. And the question isn't, are you a communist or a socialist or capitalist? The question is, what's the right mix for your society on the landscape you're in and with the communities that you have? What's the right mix? That should be it. Now, one of the problems with figuring out that mix is that there are these two different ways of thinking about property or resources. One is as private, where I own it and I can do whatever I want with it. And another is as commons, as resources that are shared. And there's some things, that probably are best thought of as private property, like your toothbrush. You don't really need to, unless you got a partner or something, probably it makes sense for everybody to have their own toothbrush. On the other hand, there are other things, like the air that we breathe, and the water that we drink that are shared. They're commons, and they have to be, in some sense, owned together and managed together. And we have to be stewards of them together as commons. And that's true not just of physical resources like fish or forests or air or water, but also things like public health. If everybody else around me is getting sick, that diminishes for me. Public health is a commons that we all share. And education is the same way. If everybody else in my state is ignorant and they don't know how to vote, that's going to diminish my experience of democracy for sure, and of life generally, right? So public education and public health and so on are these commons that we need to share and manage collectively. And generally speaking, investments in commons are really good investments for the individual as well as the community. Just one example, I live on at the end of a driveway that's about 350 feet long. I'm up here in Maine. It snows a lot in the winter. In a typical winter, I need somebody to plow my road, and I may have to pay them $450, $500, sometimes $600 to plow my road to get from my house out to the main road, right? Once I get to the main road, there's all this plowing that goes on that lets me drive to the state capitol and to Boston and all the way to Texas if I want, right? And I pay almost nothing for that. It's very inexpensive. And the reason is because as a town, my local town, and as a state, my state, have learned the lesson of Walmart. Walmart does a good job making money because they buy in bulk, And when we do the same thing for plowing for our roads, we get a good deal, right? And so sharing commons and investing in them in that way is sort of, a way of learning the lesson of Walmart, right? To manage our resources. Now, unfortunately, the typical country around the world is what is called a national security state, right? Where it's defined in terms of violence. It's defined in terms of borders that are defended by military, and the internal society that it governs through the police, right? And one of the problems with that way of framing the world in terms of violence in that way and resources is that it leads the leaders of a nation state to view the resources of that state as sort of as theirs, as national security resources, right? And for any commons like the ocean or the carbon sinks of the sky, right? Any commons, the national security state is going to have advisors that tell the leader, to look at it through the lens of control, through the lens of territorial control. What are our resources versus the other guys, right? So as a result, national security states find it really hard to see the world in terms of commons. With regard to the sky, there's our airspace, and there's Ukraine's airspace, and there's Russia's airspace. There's airspace that's defined by the territory and the control of the national security state, but they don't even really see the sky, as a commons that we all share, And that's part of the reason on climate change that it has been so incredibly hard for national security states like the US to collaborate in any really meaningful way. They pay a lot of lip service to climate change stuff, but they really have been slow to do anything about it. We've had some progress, but overall, very disappointing. In contrast, there are all these other kinds of organizations, cities, towns, countries that aren't really major national security states like Bolivia, who realize that they can't be in complete control of their world. Their borders open them up to commons that they share with other people, rivers and streams and lakes and oceans. And if they're going to manage their resources successfully, they have to collaborate with their neighbors. And so if you go to the conferences of the parties on climate change, for example, I went to one with some students in 2012 in Rio, and it was dramatic because there were two meetings going on. There was the downtown, the out of town site where the country's ambassadors and leaders were all meeting to try and negotiate treaties. And they were making practically no progress. I mean, at the time, Hillary Clinton came and she offered to throw a couple $2 billion in on some climate change mitigation stuff, but it was minimal. But if you went downtown, there was this World Social Forum kind of site where all sorts of folks from young people, indigenous people, women's groups from all around the world, towns, communities, cities, people who understood themselves as neighbors in trying to deal with the commons, who were doing all kinds of stuff. They were putting up solar panels, and there was a consortium of banks and cities in Southeast Asia that put up several $100 billion worth of money for climate mitigation stuff. Just amazing. So when you look at the world, there's that kind of change going on. And a key to it is using satyagraha or truth force as nonviolent ways of interacting with others rather than violence. And this other notion that Gandhi introduced that I want to talk about just a little bit in this context, which is Swaraj. It literally means self-rule. Raj is the word for king in Hindi. Or regime, like in the British Raj that ruled India. And Gandhi wrote extensively about this in this little book called Hind Swaraj that was about how India could become liberated through self-rule. And his strategy for that was what he called parallel government. The idea was that instead of getting guns and trying to shoot at the British till they left, you would just withdraw from cooperating, from participating in the British government, the British schools, the British law courts, the British hospitals, and so on, right? And he worked very hard and successfully in many ways with lots of other people to establish separate schools. And instead of law courts, more traditional Indian-style centers for mediation of disputes. So that if two business people got in an argument about something, instead of going to the law court, they'd go to this alternative dispute place. And his basic vision was that Indians would construct and create develop these kinds of parallel institutions, parallel to the British violence-based ones that were based in nonviolence, and kind of ignore the British. And eventually the British would become irrelevant and they would go away. In some sense, arguably, that's at least part of what actually happened. I mean, it's a complicated story, the history of India, but that basic strategy of parallel government has been used in a variety of other contexts. With the Polish Solidarity movement, for example, that liberated Poland from the Soviet bloc. And it's becoming relevant now as people talk about what they call soft secession, when they look at dealing with the United States federal government and trying to establish alternative ways of dealing, and also with state governments and other groups, how to withdraw from them to provide health services or education or dispute resolution or other kinds of stuff. And there's some expiring examples for this kind of stuff in films like A Force More Powerful, Bringing Down a Dictator, the movie Gandhi, which probably many of you have seen. Estonia had a singing revolution where they did this kind of stuff. It was quite interesting. And there's a classic Eyes on the Prize about the American civil rights movement. And there are books like The Conquest of Violence, I already mentioned, and Gene Sharp's Waging Nonviolence, which has got lots of great case studies. And then this other one called Why Civil Resistance Works, which is a book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, where they did case studies of the use of nonviolence and found that it's more in the 20th century is more successful overall than violence and led to better results. More to say about all this, but I realize I'm getting behind here. I haven't said as much about AI as I was going to, and we're coming in on 12 o'clock. There was a song, one other song I was going to do and then start talking about AI, but I don't know if I should I jump to a little bit about AI or should I just do the song?
Go for the song.
Okay. Okay. And this is one I'll try and sing. And the stuff on AI is also, there's more about it all in other videos that I've done online and obviously also my book. Okay. It's called Coming Like a Hurricane. There's a change that's a coming. There's a change that's a coming. Yes. There's a change that's a coming soon. And it's coming like a hurricane, coming like a drought. And it's coming, oh, like a glacier melting. And they say it's gonna be at least 2 degrees. They say it's gonna be at least 2 degrees. They say it's gonna be at least 2 degrees soon. And they say it may be much more. And they say it may be much more. And they say it may be much more than 2. But we all won't let it, 'cause we all finally get it, and we all are gonna make a change. Like the 19th century and slavery, we'll end fossil fuel dependency. Like the fall of the Berlin Wall, we'll make a change. Like an old-time spiritual revival or a YouTube video gone viral with 1 billion of us on bicycles make a change. Oh, hey, 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 hey. Cut by half our material consumption, invest in real creative destruction, start a political eruption, make a change. Pile up political donations, campaign door to door in conversation, take back the government of our nation, make a change. There's a change that's a coming. There's a change coming. There's a change that's a coming soon. 'Cause we're coming like a hurricane. We're coming like a hurricane. We're coming like a hurricane soon. Yes, we're coming like a hurricane. We're coming like a hurricane. We're coming like a hurricane soon. 2, 3, now.
Love it.
Well, maybe I'll stop sharing slides at that point. And thanks, everybody. Glad you like it. And maybe we can open it up for discussion. And if people want to ask stuff about AI, we can get that. But there's a lot of other stuff I've said that people may have thoughts about stuff. Is that okay?
I'll open up and I'll thank you for the time, the generosity of your spirit, your gifts, your art. Many of us here and most of us and all of us really are artists at heart. And we need that in our soul, and it brightens our day and it lifts us up to our task. And all I would say about the AI is that in your song, you talked about a video going viral. And I think that there's a lot of videos and competition. But I think that everyone who can be creative, and we're certainly venturing into that as we're new at technology. I got my first Chromebook computer during the COVID, and we were using whiteboards and a landline. So taking pictures and making videos, I think the expression is so valuable. I want to thank you. And you're encouraging us as novices. You're very well accomplished. I've read a lot of your biographies. And so I just want to tell you how blessed that Zelma is, how blessed that this resilience summit, coping to hoping. And we're coping whether we want to or not, but the hoping is what we got to keep. And I want to thank you so much and open it up. Rue Rob, you got anything?
I just want to echo all the sentiments shared by Pastor Deb. Thank you so much, Gray, for your generosity of spirit, which was what was just articulated, and also just giving healthy and genuine reminders that we are well prepared for what's to come, and we are enough if we allow ourselves to pour from a cup that is full. So thank you for filling us up. Thank you for inspiring us. And I'm excited to see what the future holds, not just with us, but for you as well.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Donna, got your hand up. Go for it.
Hey, good morning. I just wanted to thank Gray for coming here and doing this presentation. You're so talented, and your words are just so inspiring. And I love the thing about the holiday gifts or the gifts, because sometimes it's a struggle to find the right gift for someone. And I think that just opens up so much opportunity to help others. I mean, that's the way it should be, really. But that was very inspiring to me. But everything you said was just so on fire. And I just want to thank you for being here with us today. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you all.
Josiah, would you like to say something? I appreciate you getting on here on your busy day. Oh, you can't. Okay. I just wanted to recognize you and thank you for coming on here. And all of you, if anybody else has any comments or any questions or any inspirations, y'all got any songs y'all want to holler out? Thank you, Josiah. And we'll connect and follow up. And if you put your email in the chat, I'd love to follow up with you. And Alma, thank you for coming. And Cody, did you have any words here? You're a writer, a composer, and a musician.
Yeah, I did really appreciate I loved how soulful the music was and how much energy you put into it. And even the voice acting, I thought that was awesome too, with the German guy, whoever you were reenacting. But yeah, I mean, I was using AI while in this call, and I would send ChatGPT screenshots of some slides that you presented, and so it could break it down to me, because my AI understands how to navigate through my needs and thoughts and stuff, how to break things down. And I was able to really grasp and understand everything that was presented. I'm very curious about the AI part and how this comes into effect with I guess you could say, just like social ideas and experiments and stuff. Yeah, I appreciate you for giving your time to talk to us about it all. Sorry, I'm a little under the weather right now.
Oh, thanks very much.
Yeah, no problem.
I'll be glad to share a copy of all the slides with Deb, and she can forward them to everybody.
Yeah, perfect.
Would love to do that. Thank you. And also with PK and the people that are at the Shrine of the Black Madonna having the in-person summit, the parallel action. Um, I am disabled. I guess that's what the government calls me. I don't ever feel disabled. I don't feel poor. I've been poor all my life and lived in abundance. But I feel very grateful and very privileged to have all of you here today. We've spent a lot of time together, and just in fellowship with the common cause, the what we're feeling, what the Quaker George Fox would call the condition. And we are being served up miserable comforters, just like he was in the 1640s. And that's why we go all the way back and study the origins of Quakerism, because there's so many varieties of Quakerism. And, that's why I think it's important that we all know each other's cultural, and we learn about each other's religious or spiritual, what I like to call, because we don't keep ritual. We don't keep that kind of structure. We worship in silence until we're just inspired to overflow. Our cups overflow, and we must speak up. And I know it's for some people that's new, and it's exciting for me to bring new people to experience Quakerism. And we're just all at heart just humans. So if anybody else has anything else, I'd love to hear it. I will just talk at you all day long. I love you all.
I just want to say I really enjoyed the first in the first part when you spoke about peace and coming together. Actually, it was the slide on the golden rule and then the rainbow rule that I really love that perspective and thinking that way, because I was just talking to someone not that long ago. I have a hard time putting things into words, and I get a lot out of treating people the way. That's how I was saying it. That's the only thing I knew what to say is the golden rule. When you treat others the way you want to be treated, it's just a mutual respect. It kind of helps me deal with people that are uh, hard to get along with, so to speak. And when you treat everyone with the same amount of respect and kindness and love that you would want to be treated, I think you get a better reaction. But I love what you said about the rainbow rule. And I do want to look at that slide again. So please do send those to Pastor Deb. But I appreciate your outlook. I liked it a lot.
I'll be glad to send that. And there's a couple chapters actually in my book about it. And we should mention that the book, you can download it for free online as a Creative Commons PDF. I'll put a link in here to it in the chat, but it's pretty easy to find. It's Smarter Planet or Wiser Earth.com. Yeah, you can download it. But I think something, because I was kind of rushed for time, that would be good to talk about more, though, is sort of the biblical context of thinking about the golden rule. Because Jesus actually is recorded in the Bible as talking about love in two ways. One is love your neighbor as yourself, and the other is to love your enemies. And I think generally, like in the community that my grandmother and mother were raising me in in the Methodist community, but back in Baltimore, Maryland, before I was 10, and then later, the part about love your enemies is just viewed as kind of, that's hard. That's for Jesus. That's not for me. Like there are a lot of Christians who have that kind of attitude towards it, unfortunately. But then the part about love your neighbor as yourself, that it's really important to tend to those words, because it's not the same thing as the golden rule, which is often quoted. The golden rule says treat others as you would like to be treated, right? Or you want to be treated. So it's all about your likes and your wants. And it's your likes and wants that you use to decide how to treat them. Whereas Jesus has got this much richer notion of love. It's not just about liking and wanting, like I love popcorn or something like that. Love is this active thing that you do where you listen and you engage and you sacrifice and you help and you nurture, you know. And even when you don't agree with your mother or your daughter or whoever, you know, you still engage with them and you love them, even though it's really hard and you don't like what they're doing a lot of times and you don't want them to do it. But that doesn't mean you can't keep loving them, you know? And so when Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself or your daughter, or your mother, or whoever, you know, I think what he's talking about is that kind of love, you know. He's not talking about liking or your likes, and he's not talking about you using your likes and imposing them on other people. So that if you'd like to be civilized in a certain way, then you should impose your civilization on somebody else. Or if you'd like a certain kind of breakfast or a certain kind of party or a celebration or a certain politics or whatever, that you should impose that on others. I really don't believe that's what Jesus is about. He's about difference. He's about embracing, you know, the sinners, the tax collectors, everybody in their difference, you know. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I think it's, you know, I think that what most people, if they're really working at trying to love others and they take the Christian calling seriously, they have, when they use the phrase the golden rule, they have in mind this idea of love your neighbor as yourself and that rich notion of love. But so often people apply it with that other interpretation, which is much more shallow, I think. And I think it would be good to have more conversations and even sermons at churches or messages at meetings where people take this seriously and really work on it, because it pervades our culture. There, and at the there's an organization called the World Parliament of Religions, and it has people from all over the world. It's really interesting to go to. They have it once every 2 years or so, and they have, you know, people who are Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims and Jews and Christians of a wide variety of kinds, and indigenous people from Africa and other parts of the world and so on. And they sort of have been pushing this idea of the golden rule as something that all religions have in common. My own view is that it's not the view of Christianity, and I think actually if you look at other traditions like Confucian and Buddhist and others, it's not that shallow version of the golden rule that's at stake. The other thing about the rainbow rule that I think is helpful is, you know, treat others as they would have you treat them. It provides at least the beginning of a way to think about what it would mean to love your enemies. Because generally your enemies are going to have different likes and preferences. They're going to have often different cultural backgrounds and stuff. Not always, but often. And so trying to think about, well, what would it mean to love them, to really follow that heart, what seems like a hard saying from Jesus. You know, if you have as a starting point, well, treat them the way they want to be treated, but realize that means you have to enter into dialogue. And it means that you're not, if they have a, you know, if they have a kind of illness or other kind of problem that, you know, they may find that they think they want a certain kind of thing. You know, they want to catch all the fish in the pond and not leave any for next year. But actually, when they think about it, they realize, well, actually, I'd like to come back next year and catch some more fish. So maybe I should leave some fish in the pond, you know? So there are all these ways in which people, when they really start to think about what they want and put it in the context of meeting other people's needs and living in a resilient world, they start to see how there's these, what Gandhi would refer to as truths that are, you know, objective in some sense, so we can discern through clinging to truth. And that, it seems to me, is part of what Jesus was getting at, talking about loving our enemies, that we should be in dialogue with them to try and find, you know, objective moral truths that we can act on, and that we can bring them to act on. You know, it's not loving to them if they are abusive bullies and they want to bully people. It's not loving to them to help them be bullies, because that's a form of sickness, a form of of not being good, not being happy and one with the world and being connected, not having a meaningful structure for your life that you can rest easy with and go to your final sleep with, you know. So really loving them means being, you know, there's the challenge to it, of listening deeply, but then also saying what you're called to say. I'm sorry, I got going here.
No, I wanted to tell you
Oh,
that we come to a mind about, can we imagine a world without enemies? I was born in the early 60s, during the Cold War and during all that Cuban thing. And we were raised, jump under your desk, ever since we're little. And we're trying to raise our children not like that, and our grandchildren, by being in the world and not of it, and creating an intentional community. But we were also taught that Jesus would be in confusing disguises. So the homeless person you hand a bottle of water to, or hear a veteran asking for a little handout in front of the hamburger place, we were taught by our granddaddy that might be Jesus in all his confusing disguises. And so when I learned about other religions, I was probably 13 or 15, but I was amazed at how many Jesus archetypes were in each religion I was looking at. There was a goodness, there was a common thread, a common willingness for peace and love. And I really do hope that we can look into that parliament of the religions. I think Zelma Friends will look into it, and we'll circle back with you on it. And perhaps closer to the end of the year, we'll do maybe another one and speak on that and gather people. We belong to the Rice University Center for RPLC, for religious policy and religious life. And it's all manner of communities of different faiths and no faiths coming in just to be curious and share. And so I think those manner of, like you called them, affinity groups or consortiums and gatherings, that's what I would like to look at for next year for Zelma Friends. And was anybody else wanting to jump in here and not let me just talk it all up now? I see y'all might have an opinion. And if not, I'll turn it back to Gray. Thank you, Gray.
um, I might, just as a um, follow up to what you were just saying there, Deb, share one of the slides that was going to come after the AI stuff, late in my talk, um, which is right here. Um, wait a second. Sorry. See if I can get it here. Oh, here we go. Okay. This is just this idea that in just as in economics, you can have a sort of a monological approach to thinking that's like the rational economic man versus the change maker, history maker, dialogical approach. The same thing is true in religion. And I think part of what faith and spiritual practice is about for many people is, having a path to being at one with the world and one with reality and one with the ultimate reality. And one strategy for that that's common is to sort of seek homogeneity, have everybody be the same by dogmatically insisting on some kind of monological monotheism with an exclusive authority, with a text of some kind that, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita or a particular translation of the Bible or what have you, that is the authority, and it gives the set of premises to draw all the conclusions that we should in all of our life. And I think, as a Quaker, as a Christian, and just as a person, I think I would say that my experience of the divine is is richer than that. I think the divine exceeds any particular book, any particular human language, any particular sensory modalities of humans. It is just sort of more infinitely rich than that. So there are many faces and voices of the divine, and a way of seeking, the way of being at one is by seeking unity, by opening in dialogue to these many faces and voices of the divine. It's by, the unity happens through dialogue, not through a common starting point that we all have to accept, but rather a common convergence that we all encounter through our differences, and the ways in which they enrich us and help us learn from each other. Anyway, that's something that it occurred to me might be relevant to what you were saying, Deb.
There's a question in the chat.
Okay.
Kirby asked, what can we do with religious groups that organize around hate, misogyny, misogynoir, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, etc.? They say God tells them to do this. How would you answer that, Gray?
Well, it can be hard, can't it? I mean, I think we have, I think there's, you know, on the one hand, we have to kind of listen and try and listen their better selves into being. There's this, sometimes, you know, the listening is, I mean, part of the point of listening to them is to get them to hear themselves also, you know. And a lot of times, one of the best ways to persuade somebody that their own view is wrong is just ask them to explain it better, you know, and just keep listening. And as you do, they just, you're helping them hear themselves better, you know. Sometimes to get them to listen to themselves, you got to do some kind of clinging to truth, some kind of satyagraha that sort of, that may involve some kind of sacrifice, you know, something that, uh, you know, involves taking your own time, sacrificing money or opportunities or other things, being embarrassed, being vulnerable, you know, in a way that somehow demonstrates to them that you're serious and that they should be serious in this kind of dialogue, this sharing. I think in this context, I think George Fox, which I guess you guys have been reading about, you know, and the early Quakers, to me, there was an incredible brilliance and power in the innovation that they introduced into the ways of preaching and converting people to walk in the light, live in the faith, try to live in truth and help communities prosper in truth. And the innovation was, it seems to me, that around this idea of authority. You know, the Quakers were resisting the claims that they thought were false of people who had been to Cambridge and Oxford, who had read a bunch of books, could read Latin and so on, and could stand up in a pulpit on a Sunday and deliver a great truth that comes from this authority, right? Even though it didn't come from their hearts, didn't come through their experience, and wasn't really matching the experience of the other people, often young people that were attending those sermons. But what Fox and James Naylor and Margaret Fell and these other early Quakers did, they didn't go and say, listen to me, I've got the book. The other guys are wrong, or I've got the language, it's not Latin, it's Greek, or something like that, right? What they did was say, there's that of God in you. Turn to your inward teacher, right? And well, one thing that was really brilliant about that is that, you know, they found that actually there is this kind of inward teacher. It's not just a private voice of me, but it's a kind of power of light and understanding and love that when people listen to it can come through them, right? And teach how to be in dialogue, how to make peace, how to live with others in the world. So, I mean, that was the fact that's, I think, I agree with them that that's a true way to be looking at spiritual truth, that it's there in everyone, and everyone can look inwardly in that sense, especially when they have others to help them sort of tune up their amplifiers, their listening devices. Um, but the other thing is that, from the point of view of doing kind of mission work, think about how great it is that you don't need as many missionaries, because you can just get everybody else to do your mission work for you, namely the people who are, who are listening, right? They all have this inward teacher. So if you could just get them to start listening to God, listening to the divine, listening to the Christ within, Christ that's come to teach his people himself, if you just get people to start listening to that, then you can redirect your other efforts elsewhere, you know? So as a mission strategy, it's really, shall we say, cost effective.
I love that word mission strategy, because we're talking about speaking truth to power implies we're not in the power. So if we are, and that even goes true for when George Fox and those early Quakers, found that the power structures weren't fitting, and they were contradictory and hypocrisy. I think also when people are wrapping their cause up in their God, I think that it's very important to listen. Of course, depending on what they're doing, it's harder to listen. But if we do listen and we know where they're coming from, we can also just say, pray for them. And however we pray, whoever we pray to, if it's a silent prayer. So that's really another thing, is so that we don't always have to feel oppressed. We can sometimes realize that we've gotten there ahead of time. Some of us are future, getting back to the Quaker Institute of the future. Whether we're old or young, some of us are not ever stationed in the past. We can operate in the present with our eye in the future. And I think sometimes that allows us, not that we shouldn't know the past and we shouldn't have remedy and reparation, but that the true liberty is being in the present here and now, but with your eye in the future. And so I want to tell you, that's to me what you represent, that we can recycle and keep replenishing. And so that's really how I would tell you. I would let you know that would be my wrap up, or my idea, is that I know we feel oppressed. I know people think about ways to do it. But what you said about the Women's March made a lot of sense, because marching is one thing. Standing in front of a congressman's office holding a sign for 400 weeks, well, that's dedication. But also, here's what I want. Here's, let me, put my thing on the door. There has to be a way that we can come to our truth, to their power. And as we meet, we know we might be overpowered in force, but people power is actually the real power. I think we've seen that proven over time and over history. Greg, could you?
Yeah, I do. And I think point I would add to that is, I think sometimes here in the U.S. in the recent decades, people have sort of assumed that nonviolence is about just um, protesting, where you hold signs or sing songs or shout, expressing your views. And a lot of times, people have worked out ways of collaborating with the police. So they'll say, okay, you can go to this park this time and have a rally. You can be on the mall in DC, or you can be in this big park or this parking lot in the Capitol. And there are times when that kind of rallying can be really helpful to bring people together and hear each other's voices and see other people that share common views and stuff. But on the other hand, it's possible for the power elite structures to just simply direct the protest activity to places where it's convenient for them to let it happen and not pay any attention. And part of what was really powerful about the nonviolence work of Rosa Parks and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and other groups that are documented in that wonderful series, Eyes on the Prize, about the American Civil Rights Movement. Part of what was common to them, and also common to Gandhi in his work, was people would find ways, strategic ways, to exercise power that really exercised power, right? By, for example, going and sitting in a lunch counter that was segregated and refusing to leave until the police came. And doing that, disrupted the lunch counter, and it disrupted the police. The police had to take them to jail, right? And so all these resources start getting spent. But also, there's this wonderful episode in A Force More Powerful that it was called "We Were Warriors." It's about the Nashville student sit-ins that successfully integrated the lunch counters in Nashville. And the students did not just go to a park somewhere and get lots of good video feed for the TV news about their protest. They went and sat in on the lunch counters, and they made it hard for the lunch counter owners, Woolworths, to make money. And after months of not making money, and then seeing their busiest, most important season come around Easter, the downtown merchants who found that people were avoiding them and avoiding downtown because of the protests actually went to the mayor of Nashville and said, "You got to do something, you know, we got to end these protests, and we got to do it in a way that lets the rest of the country think that we're reasonable human beings and we're not, you know, horrible racists that are violent and that with horrible police that will scare away any tourists. And so my point is that there's this kind of there are these other forms of nonviolent power that can be exercised that go beyond just speaking truth to power, but actually exercising power. But they typically do involve sacrifice. They involve this clinging to truth or truth force that involves self-suffering. And well, anyway, I just thought that would be worth adding to your point, Deb. Well, I really enjoyed this a lot, and I really appreciate you all taking time to hear my thoughts and share them. And I will share a PDF of my slides, and hopefully we'll be able to share the recording of all this.
I will.
And I would be glad, I'm always glad for other opportunities to talk with people about these things. I think we're going to, as a nation, be facing a lot of hard times in the coming months as things come to a head increasingly in conflicts. And so we're going to have to be sharing points of view and learning from each other in different states what's going on and how we can deal with it. And I'm ready to do that kind of collaboration with anybody that's interested, and would love to learn more from you all. I'm really impressed with the ways in which you all are, systematically trying to revisit Quaker roots and learn from them, and struggle, even though you live in a sort of in a wealthy state and even a wealthy city. You live in an area of it, as I understand from Deb, that has a lot of economic and other challenges, and you're struggling with it and turning to each other and sort of enjoying the riches that you each bring to all this and supporting each other in the challenges you have. And it's just a great witness to everybody else that you're doing that. So thank you for that witness, and I look forward to being in touch and being connected.
We look forward to working with the Quaker Institute of the Future, and we aspire to send a couple of our young people to your events and maybe one of your summer projects. Zed, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Zed, before you talk, can I just say
Please.
that Deb's point, yeah, we would love to have people come to the summer research seminar. And also, if we have a scholarship program for young friends. It's not a lot. It's like $500. But if somebody has a leading and you're trying to think about, well, what should I do with this? And how could I find some time to not wait tables or whatever it is I do in my life every night, and actually explore that leading some and maybe meet with some people, have a clearness committee. It's for that kind of thing. And we're hoping to have other kinds of funds. And some of our people have done these youth scholarships with us have done that. One of them ended up writing a book and got support for doing that about his work in prisons and starting a worship group within a prison in Vermont. So if any of you are interested in anything like that, or starting a circle of discernment, trying to think through some issue and strategy, and if you think it would be helpful to have others who want to have a kind of Quakerly dialogical approach to it, please be in touch. Sorry.
PK, and I'll follow up with you on that because PK is Think Peace International. She's delivering a Sankofa presentation right now. And so we will be following up on that and our pilgrimages. Thank you so much, Gray. Zed, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you so much, Mr. Cox. And I am really honored to sit through this talk that you just gave us. And I just want to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. And my other question is that, is it possible to come for a retreat to where you are sometimes to learn more, to kind of have some kind of prayer or?
I teach at a college, and we don't have a retreat center here. The Quaker Institute doesn't have a fixed campus.
Okay.
We do things online, but I'm happy to be exploring with you ways to do things online, or maybe to help you be in touch in person, to travel to places where members of the Quaker Institute are.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Greg Cox, Quaker Institute of the Future. And we will bless and release at 12:37. And I'll follow up with you in the next day or two, and we'll talk more on getting all the resources and materials out and our future opportunities. And I want to thank you very much. You're welcome to stay with us, but you probably have a busy day. We're going to have some neighborhood conversations. We have some people coming in at 1 to talk about Northeast Super Neighborhood United and about the City of Houston resilience plans. So that's what we have coming up. And right now we just have open time for anybody that wants to speak or talk. And if everyone's talking and spoken out, I'll put the music back on and we'll wait on PK to come in and talk about Sankofa.
Okay, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Gray.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.